Hello, and welcome to Have Your Say here at Radnor Studio 21. I'm Ann Minicozzi, founder of the Community Breakfast of the Main Line Undoing Racism Day, here with our co-host Diana Robertson, president of the Main Line NAACP. And our guest today is Brendon Jobs, who is history faculty at the Haverford School, and he's also the director of diversity and inclusion. So welcome to Have Your Say, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be with you both.
Thanks. And to start off with, could you talk about some background about yourself and how you came to become a teacher?
I came to teaching by chance. And I think it wasn't accidental, but it was definitely by chance. I always thought, I'm the first generation son. I'm a first generation immigrant son. Right? My family's from Trinidad. The majority of my family is still in Trinidad or not in the States. My grandmother moved here in 1973, so a little less than 50 years ago, in search of something different, something better, and I think I took that on as a first-generation child and imagined, well, I need to do something important. I need to value education. I need to become a doctor or a lawyer or a businessman, make a lot of money. So teaching wasn't something that was talked about in my house as something that you run towards. But with that said, I spent some time in Trinidad with my other grandmother, who actually happens to have been a head of school for boys. Gloria, she was head of the Belmont School for Boys. And my brother and I, in 1993 or 4, we were down there because there was a coup. We were actually trapped on the island and had to go to school at her school. And I think it was there where I got the bug, or at least like the inclination that teaching was interesting and something that is in me. I ended up coming to teaching more practically. There's an organization called Teach for America. I started with that. I got into Teach for America, and I moved to Philadelphia in 2005 to join the Corps. I actually got kicked out of the Corps before I finished training. I had a really rough time, in the summer training part of it. You got about a month to prove that you're ready to teach in the toughest classrooms, and that month wasn't long enough for me. It wasn't. I would argue it wasn't long enough for a lot of the people who were a part of my cohort. So I went to go in paralegal for a couple of years, just thinking that teaching wasn't for me.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yes. And I was going to go to law school. I was on this track. I was going to law, and I was dreadfully bored at that firm. It was dreadful, and it wasn't just the firm. I wasn't passionate about the law, and I think that's something I got in college, and something I did get from my household and from my grandmother Helen's movement here, that passion is really important. Passion is maybe the most important thing. So when I was in that firm, I said to myself, well, what do you care about? I really care about history. I'm going to go back to teaching and I'll try it out. So I went in with teaching fellows in Philadelphia and started teaching probably 2 years after I started paralegaling. I was still paralegaling part-time while I was teaching, and I started at the Philadelphia High School for Girls, and I was there for 7 years. That school that school was, wow.
Yeah. Oh, you went to that school?
I went to school. That's where I graduated. Yeah.
254. I was dean of the class of 254.
Oh, okay.
I think it was 2011. I still talk to so many of those women, but I was there for about 7 years. I know that's why I'm still teaching to this day. That space was an incubator for me. It was majorly black and brown. I identify as queer, so it was also a space that was really affirming for me, and it was also a space where I saw in many ways my reflection, because I'm the oldest of 4 children. I have a brother who's 4 years younger than I am, and there's a 10-year gap between us and then 2 of my sisters. My youngest sister just turned 20, and she's actually in the Navy. She's in San Diego. I'm gonna go visit her this summer. And my other sister is in New York City and Brooklyn, doing cybersecurity work at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Just like these amazing, they were amazing. They're amazing women now, you know, strong women, but they were amazing girls growing up. And you know, when they were growing up, I was in the midst of Girls High, you know. So, that was the space that gave me the passion for teaching. You know, I still draw on it today. So I got into teaching, you know, roundabout. I did not expect to be a teacher, but I couldn't imagine doing anything else.
Okay.
But you did have that example of your grandmother who was heading up a boys' school. So that's an example right there in your life. That was good. The other thing I wanted to say is, it's really good. It's a good example also that you tried the Teach for America, and it didn't work out, but then you tried again, you know? So that's good. I think that's a good lesson that we can learn, that if there is something that, you know, it calls to you, it's your interest, that you give it a try again.
And I'm glad that I was able to. We're living in like cancel culture. Have you heard of this?
No.
This cancel culture is if a celebrity or somebody even in your life does something wrong or bad, you just cut them off. You just don't give them. There's no like space for reconciliation or the healing of a hurt, you know?
I think of that in terms of the TV remote control. You know, you can just press stop or pause or unfriend somebody or something like that. And it's just so, you know, we need to have those in-between spaces. Yeah.
So the Haverford School, so how did you end up?
I was kind of accidental also. I mean, but not accidental. It was, I had been teaching in the Philadelphia School District for a decade, just about. And I was at the Philadelphia High School for Girls for the majority of it, and felt there was a need for a change, so I moved to a co-ed space, the Girard Academic Music Program. I loved to sing, I loved music, I played a lot of instruments growing up, so I knew this was the space for me, you know, this space just filled with kids who are so focused on art and expression, you know, and passion, you know, they're a talented bunch. So I was there for 3 years, and the school district was in the middle of a wage freeze, you know, and there were all these threats and actual like cuts that have been made to the personnel. So there were nurses, or barely any counselors, support services that, you know, our kids desperately needed, and we needed as teachers to be able to do our work with them. And you know, our work isn't just curricular, our work is developing humans and like creating connectivity within the classroom space. And I was getting to the point where I was tired, you know. And that's when I started looking outward. You know, I wasn't sure if I was ready to leave the classroom or to leave teaching, but I was getting tired, so I started looking around, and Haverford was an opportunity. There was an opportunity to be a history instructor at the Haverford School, and there was also an opportunity to go and do some consulting work at the Gates Foundation. I don't know if you know this, but the teaching workforce is about 80% white and female. So there's and while, you know, the student population is not 80% white, so there's like a mismatch in terms of the students of color and, you know, the teachers who are before them as models, you know, and as cheerleaders and supporters. So the Gates Foundation invited me out to go and do some research work with them around the pipeline, diversity in the teacher pipeline.
And where did you do that?
In Seattle.
Wow.
Yeah, I was Seattle. For about 3 months I was with them right before I started Haverford. Right? I actually got the word that I was hired to teach at the Haverford School while I was out in Seattle.
Oh, okay.
And it was also in that moment I had to make that really tough decision, you know, to leave the school district of Philadelphia. I never, well, I hadn't really considered it, you know. I was really nervous about leaving the district for a number of reasons, but mostly because of how much of a home and a community I had formed, you know, not the schools I was in. When you're working in the school district of Philadelphia, you know, you're at your school, but I mean, the most dynamic teachers are in the community, you know, they're between schools, we're working with each other, with organizations like Teacher Action Group and university diversity partners, and so I was a part of this energy in the city, and I didn't want to. I was really nervous about stepping away from that because so much beauty exists within it. So I decided to try something else. Because I started to feel tired, but also because I saw so much opportunity in the independent school community. Haverford, when I went to interview, I didn't know much about it at all. Like I had been inside at one time. I'd heard things about it. I'd met some graduates in my own just Philadelphia institution. So they're just like Girls High Girls are everywhere. Haverford gentlemen are everywhere. So I had met Haverford guys before. But I was surprised by the amount of students of color, the percentage of the students of color who were in the space, and also the amount of faculty of color who were in the space. So I felt like this was a space that I could play in. You know.
And now, when you started at the Haverford School, were you the director coming in as also the director of diversity inclusion, or did that happen later on?
That happened later on.
Okay.
I've been at Haverford now for this is my 3rd year, and next year will be the 4th. And when I entered the Haverford School, I was entered as history faculty. I'm still teaching, but much less now, because my work is across divisions instead of just in the upper school division. But I was working with Dante Evans. Dante Evans is the director of community, so I was his assistant, the assistant of community life. And it was there where I started to work with students and work with faculty and talk to parents more and learn more about the community and the role. I'm the first director of diversity and inclusion at the Haverford School. That's where the role grew out of, the work that I was doing with Dante, you know, as his assistant. The questions that started becoming just apparent, you know, the questions, I think, and the work around the questions that the community was brave enough to engage with created the space for this work, for this position that's functioning now.
And how do you see, so with this position, then how are you able to bridge gaps and have conversations and deal with issues, per se?
Issues like what?
Well, I mean, so we're talking about diversity and inclusion, and you did say that what is the percentage? You said that there is a pretty high percentage.
We're close to 30%.
Okay. Close
to 30% students of color and around 17% faculty of color. So again, there isn't that match.
Okay, right.
But when I was in the city, I was often the only faculty member of color or the only black male in spaces. So it's about 30%, around 17.
Okay. So is there a specific plan for outreach to faculty, or so to help to bring that, you know, lessen the gap, so to speak?
Oh, yeah.
And so, what about curriculum? I'm just curious about that.
Okay, so we have a strategic plan that we've built out over the past year or so, around 2 years, around diversity and inclusion in particular. And the word that we've been using is, or the phrase that we've been using is capacity building. So when hard things happen, when tensions arise, when people are stressed, you know, racially stressed, or are stressed around other aspects of identity, you know, what do you do? You know, how do you react? How do you respond? How do you notice? How do you read situations? These are the types of questions that we're grappling with, and there are a number of spaces that we have to grapple with them. So one is, I didn't start the SEED program there. It's Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. It's about a year-long program, about 10 months. Once a month, a cohort of faculty members who are dedicated to the work meet with, it's myself and a faculty partner of mine, Susanna Lambor. She's my SEED partner. We run sessions on gender, sexuality, racial literacy, class, and get people to engage with their own stories. Right? Their own stories around how they've developed awareness or consciousness in terms of engaging with these aspects of themselves. And with the idea that if you figure out like how you engage, especially as adults, but also as kids, if you figure out how you engage with these aspects of identity within yourself or how they've developed within your story, then it gives you some fodder to practice with when you're actually engaging with people. So SEED is one space, but within the student body, there's the Diversity Alliance, and off of the Diversity Alliance, a number of affinity groups, or 3 affinity groups that are relatively new: the Black Student Union, the Pan Asian Students Association, and also very newly formed the Gay Straight Alliance. And these are, I name these organizations in relationship to SEED because these are the places where people come to do the work of not just figuring out, well, how do we bridge gaps? It's a really broad question to throw at somebody, but the question becomes then is, what's your story? You know, how do we get better at sharing our stories with each other? Because that's kind of our theory of action of how you bridge the gaps. You create space for people to cultivate authentic friendships, you know, and if you can cultivate authentic friendship, then you can create a space where people can actually find belonging. And I say that in relationship to, you know, the data and the stats and the academia on how we live. We live in segregated communities. So if we live in communities that are not mixing in these ways, then how do we expect that mixture to happen in school or in these spaces where we do convene? One of my mentors, Elijah Anderson, he's a sociologist, wrote this, or has this idea of cosmopolitan canopies. Rittenhouse Square is an example of one, where people come together and it looks like everybody's mixing, everybody's nice, we all get along, but if you scratch underneath the cosmopolitan canopy, there's a lot of division because we're not practiced in figuring out what these interactions look like. Another mentor of mine, Howard Stevenson, who's doing so much work, so inspired, so much work with racial literacy, so much, it's his work is absolutely, and I had engaged with his work until I came out to the independent school community. The racial literacy idea where figuring out how to navigate stressful situations is about being practiced in navigating them is so huge, right? So in terms of bridging gaps, these are like a couple organizations at the Haverford School where people get the space to think about their own stories, share them, and to like figure out how to practice these negotiations.
Yeah. There's a couple of observations that I want to make, because this whole process of having diversity and inclusion has started somewhat recently in the past 20-something, 30 years, where this is really starting to happen. Coming up with a language, and you were touching on that with racial literacy, you know, that we're all coming up with a language so we can talk about these things, and there's terms and vocabulary words now that we didn't have before that we can actually talk about these things. And 2 observations, this component of getting people to be able to tell their story. It makes us reflect, and then you tell your story, and then when all different people are telling a story, then that enriches all of our experiences, because now we're hearing stories that we haven't heard before, that we haven't included before. So we're getting a richness out of that. And then the other thing, by talking about creating spaces, like I can see, just observing what's happening with you at the Haverford School, is you have a space, so then this organic process can now happen where you're listening to the different constituencies in the community, the students and the faculty, and how to have everybody have dialogue with each other and conversations with each other, so then you can kind of make what you need as you go along. So I really like that dynamic. And it's happening.
Flying the plane as you build it.
Right. And I think that's important, because with telling, and I think the other piece of it is the listening. You know, because people, if you're not listening, or depending upon if you are, what are you hearing? You know, and then how do you want to respond? Or, you know, how do you want that experience to be something that you can now have a basic reaction with. You know, that you can say, okay, I'm learning, using it as a learning opportunity rather than, oh, this is my story, but this is always going to be my story, versus now taking this and saying, and listening to others and saying, well, maybe whatever I thought was this person's story isn't. And in listening, now I'm learning something new.
And I want to add something to that too, like this idea of hearing somebody else's story and listening to it. There's also, I think, the idea of doing it from a space of, and this is like mindfulness practice is a part of the way we engage this, if we're really doing it right, of non-judgment, trying to be non-judgmental as you're taking in somebody else's story. So often when I'm just in my own life, and especially as I was coming up and learning myself, learning myself as a part of the work, because that's also a part of the process of being in these inclusion roles. You're learning so much about yourself as you're engaging, you know, in stressful situations, in beautiful situations. You're learning so much about yourself. It's I get the question so often, or not the question, the comment. After you say something, I don't buy that. I don't buy that. I've just told you my story. I'm not selling it to you. This is my story, right?
Yeah,
but that not I don't buy that isn't a it's not nefarious. I think it's a natural knee jerk to cognitive dissonance that, you know, somebody else's story that you're not familiar with might bring up for you. So what do you do to try to reconcile it? You try to make it like yours. You try to shape-shift it, right? So part of the practice is also listening to people's stories, hearing them, and doing it from a space of non-judgment, maybe looking for commonalities, or maybe not looking for commonalities, just taking the story and as something unique, beautiful, hard, and hopefully fruitful. And fruitful in that, you know, it creates like a clearer understanding of who the human in front of you is.
Do you see this as something, because I think the other part of the conversation is the diversity and inclusion, you know, there are areas in employment, you know, education and otherwise, that there are those who say that's not needed. You know, they don't see it as something that's important enough to have an individual or a category that area comes up to even discuss. You know, so what would your response be to that?
Well, I would just throw a lot of research at them. That typically doesn't work when you get that type of response from someone. I think those responses are, again, like the defense. And I say defense not in a way that's combative, but in a way that's natural when something doesn't make sense yet, when something like brings up for someone a cognitive dissonance. It's just a noise, you know. Cognitive dissonances are very they're stressful, you know. So if you're confronted with this idea that, you know, diversity, that's not your experience, then what will your response be? Oh, we don't need that because I've never needed it before. But Harvard Business Review over the past several years, for people that are really concerned about, you know, the capitalization of this, I suppose, has written and hosted a number of discussions and dialogues and YouTube videos about how a number of voices, a number of experiences around any problem, or any, and not a problem not being a conflict, problem being, you know, something, a project that we have to tackle. Having the most diverse set of voices makes it so that, you know, blind spots that might not otherwise be caught as a part of managing the project or figuring out the problem become apparent readily, you know. And of course, Harvard Business Review is borrowing drawing from all of this psychology and all of this academia that is also like supporting these ideas. We started at Haverford this year. We had we have our summer opening meetings like any other school, and our summer reading last year was Blind Spot by Marjorie Banaji, and we actually had Chris Dial come down from the Harvard Implicit Bias Lab, which is so awesome, to give the entire community a tutorial on blind spots, what they are, how they show up, and how difficult they are to read, because they're blind. Like, you're blind to it, right? So that's how I respond to this idea that diversity, inclusion, we don't need it. I think it's a defense, and I appreciate it as a defense, because I don't think that it's something that we've always engaged. Actually, right. And we're at a moment where there's so much tension. There's a rise in hate crimes in schools across the country. Schools, not just the country. Schools across the country. There's a rise in hate crimes. The FBI is saying this, and Teaching Tolerance is saying this, and kids are crying out about this in school communities across the country. I can't ignore those cries, right? And so those cries tell me that we're in a different moment, and we're in a moment where we actually have school communities and adults really thinking about how to engage not diversity but inclusion as the practice of getting people to actually engage with each other in these spaces. So when I hear that, it's a defense, but I don't think it's. I think that's where it comes from. Okay. Yeah.
So our time.
I was trying to think of where it comes from.
Time is winding up quickly, but to have a last comment on basically, what would be your recommendation in regard to, in particular, schools who do not address these issues in the way that you've seen that they can be addressed at Haverford? What would be your recommendation to the schools? What would be your recommendation to schools in general, not to mention other areas, but in particular educational institutions, whether it's lower school, higher, institutions of higher education, in regard to being able to have this category of diversity and inclusion as part of who they are? What would you say to those schools who do not have that right now?
So. And I think this would resonate with them, because I've been in a couple of these school communities. I've actually been called in to support some school communities like this, and I would say community matters, belonging matters, friendship matters, and these are the things that make schools really beautiful places. These are the things that make schools spaces that kids want to come back to as adults. My girls, high girls come. I see them I see them everywhere, and when I see them on the street, sometimes I get a Mr. Jobs, and I mean, there's nothing that I feel it here, and I get a little teary-eyed when it happens when I think about it, because I am reminded of the amount of community and belonging that I felt in that space, and that I feel in the space outside of the space. So I say that because if we want our children not just to be successful in the world, be good project managers, but we want them to have these feelings for our school communities and to have these feelings for each other, we have to remember that community matters, belonging matters, and friendship matters.
Okay. So we thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you.
Clearly, we could continue to talk about the topic, but we thank you for being our guest today, and that we want everybody to know, as you listen to the conversation that we have had, that we encourage you to think about it, consider it, and we are interested in you being able to have your say. Thank you.